So once again, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I was very delighted to be invited to talk to you about one of my favourite topics. I'm a bit strange like that. My favourite topic is standards and standardisation. So I was introduced already, so who am I? My name is Rory O'Connor. I'm from Dublin City University in Ireland. No, that's not Trinity College. I think most of you know that inferior institution. We are a much younger technological university in Ireland, and I also work with LERO, the Irish Software Research Centre. I'm a software engineer. So most of what I do would be classified as software engineering, but I'm really interested in things like how we develop software systems, the project management approaches, the process management approaches, the human aspects of software development in particular. And that's led me off on all sorts of paths about that. And I'm interested particularly in how standards and standardization helps to improve the areas of software engineering, software quality. So how can we do things better? Just a little bit on job titles. Job titles are great things. We should all have lots and lots of them. Okay, it would be nice if we got paid for all of them, maybe. So I have at least three job titles. I'm a professor in the School of Computing in DCU. I'm the head of department there, and I'm a senior researcher with LERO. But maybe for this talk, I have some other job titles that sound really good. This first one, head of delegation, makes me sound important. It doesn't pay any money. In fact, actually quite the opposite. It costs me lots of money. And I represent, and I have done for the last 10 years, Ireland in the international standards community on behalf of our national standards body, and a whole heap of other things. I convene standards committees. I'm a member of a number of standards committees, and I'm an editor of standards. So it's really in the context of these roles that I'm here talking to you. So what am I going to talk about? I want to talk about standards. And that immediately has for me one big challenge. Okay, and the big challenge for talking about standards is a lot of people tell me, as we heard in the opening, that standards are dry, they're dull, they're boring, a bit like watching paint dry. So hopefully I'm here to try and explain to you that actually standards are very interesting. So my challenge today is essentially to make sure that I'm not looking at this. I'm a little bit worried. There was some very nice wine and food last night and dancing, and I think maybe everybody's a little tired. So my challenge is to make you as enthusiastic about standards as I am. So I'm a little evangelical maybe about standards, and hopefully I will persuade you. But what I do ask is for the next approximately 40 minutes to keep an open mind. Okay, that's really all, to keep an open mind about standards and standardization. So what's the first thing to say? Well, we could look at the standard sales pitch for standards and why we should be getting involved in standardization. We heard yesterday in Jan's keynote that the very best time to be around is now. And he's right. We live in an amazing world full of incredible opportunities, full of incredible possibilities. This is a wonderful time to be here. But we also live in a very complex world, with lots of challenges facing our environment, our economy, society as a whole. So we have lots of challenges. And my argument is actually that's where standards and standardization can come in and help us. So what happens when things don't go right? You know, and you start like this pulling your hair out. Often it's because standards are absent or haven't been applied. And life, I would argue, is that much simpler, that much easier, that much richer when standards are applied. In other words, there's an easy way and there's a hard way. So let me give you the argument for. Okay. Standards help to make the world a safer place, cleaner place, more efficient place. Everything from food safety to computers to healthcare and technologies. So just think about that. Maybe the next time you go into a hospital, as a patient, if you're unlucky to be connected to some machines that are there breathing for you or injecting medication into you automatically. Okay, we really hope the very best practices and standards in the world have gone into those medical devices. Now, I could start to scare you by telling you the amount of recalls on medical devices every year due to software errors, and you would never ever go near a hospital ever again. But standards are something there that do help make this world cleaner and safer. They make a positive difference to all our lives. Why? Because they utilize the wealth of international experience and wisdom. And really that's what you're doing, getting an international global perspective on best practices and wisdom from around the world. And I would argue actually that they help, if anything, open up, not close down, but open up new markets, new approaches, better trade for all countries, including developing countries. And they help tackle global issues like climate change, road safety, energy, social responsibility, things like that. And I would argue they build a confidence today, tomorrow, in the future. So there's the sales pitch. Do you believe it? A little bit. That's good. Okay, that's an open mind. A little bit. All right. But I haven't convinced you yet. No, that's okay. That's part of my job here. I did say keep an open mind. So I did say that's also the sales pitch. So think about it. Standards actually are everywhere. They affect every single part of your life, not necessarily consciously that you're aware of it, but they do. You look at your children's toys, for example, and what standards are there. One example, safety aspects relating to the mechanical and physical properties of children's toys is an international standard, ISO 8124. And you can look and see in your country of residence that many children's toys every year get withdrawn from sale or taken back from market or stopped at the import borders for not meeting the standards necessary for safety for your child. When you're at work, where do standards? They protect your health, your livelihood, your well-being. So think about this person going into work. There's a number of different standards that are protecting her in work. From the standards for the helmet, the standards for the eye goggles, the standards for the haz vest you're wearing. And these are all European standards, international standards. And without these, one would argue that maybe one's health is at risk. How about you're in an office environment? Yep. Standards are there too for you, the office environment. Something as simple as the keyboard that you have is an international standard from the Electoral Technical Commission and the International Standards Organization. How about ergonomics? There are standards for ergonomics, how you sit at your desk, how the positioning of your desk, things like that. When you're at play yourself, here I am with somebody with an iPod. What have you got? You've got international standards for things like audio recording, MPEG encoding, things like this. So standards essentially are absolutely everywhere. You see barcodes all over the place. Barcodes, international standard 18004 for those. And I want to take a particularly Irish perspective on this. And I would say to you that there are some standards are simply just vital for life. Okay, that I don't want to be in a world if some standards don't exist. And I would draw your attention to one particular standard, IS 417, the Irish standard for making Irish coffee. I really don't want to live in a world where this is not a standard. Getting the right mix of sugar, coffee, cream and whiskey, it's vital. And this is a real standard, by the way, and you may get, I'll give you a copy if you would like. It's freely available, Irish standard for coffee. The secret ingredient being the Jameson whiskey, if you didn't know. So, am I giving you a panacea and saying, wow, standards are the cure for absolutely all of the world's ills? Am I selling a vision of utopia, of motherhood and apple pie? Well, maybe I am a little, so I'm coming on a bit heavy with that. So, let's maybe be a bit realistic. So, step back and talk about sort of realism and idealism and where are we. So what's the real truth about standardization and how they affect us? So the real truth behind standards is there's actually a lot of misunderstanding and misconception around standards. Okay, and what we really want to do is look at some of the myths and the realities. Lots of people have said, oh, don't like that stuff, it's all boring, it's dull, it's legalistic or something like that. And there's lots of these things. So we want to try and shed a little bit of light on some of those misconceptions. Excuse me. There's myths about standards that are really based on sort of hearsay, rumours, half-truths, many of which people have repeated so often they actually start to believe them. And they become accepted as truth within sort of the public consciousness. And a lot of that has got to do with standards are very bureaucratic, very time-consuming, very expensive, and they're only meant for really large corporations. They're not meant for smaller organizations, things like that. And I want to try and debunk some of those myths now while talking with you. So by debunking some of those standards myths, try and inject some positivity into the whole concept of standardization and why it's good for you. And particularly for the academics in the audience, not just the industrial people, but what can it do for you as an academic, as a researcher? And I have a strong message for you on that as well. So standards are relevant only to large organizations? Absolutely not. This is something you hear all the time. No, I've worked with many, many very small organizations that have been accredited in standards. The smallest organization I've ever worked with that got accreditation against ISO 9000 was a one-person company. They did it for competitive advantage. They did it to make sure they were better than the competition. They wanted to be seen to be accredited, even if they're only a one-person company. I work with a lot of what are called VSEs, very small enterprises, which are companies of less than 25 people, according to one particular international standard, ISO 29110, which is a process lifecycle standard for companies. And this is aimed purely at small companies, and most of the companies we work with are about 5 employees. And we have lots of success stories from using that. So that is at least one absolute myth. They're only applicable to products. Sometimes you think you must be making a physical product. Nope. Standards apply to services, for example, and all sorts of different aspects of operations as well. So we can talk about things like the governance of IT. So we have ISO standards like 38500 for governance. How do we implement good governance protocols in my organization? It's really difficult to find the right standard. Yeah. Well, one of the problems is there's an awful lot of them. Okay, there's a huge amount of them, but actually finding the most appropriate ones is relatively straightforward when you get a little bit of advice from people who understand this world. And another one we hear a lot is that they're for other people, they're written by other people, for other people, they're not listening to me. Absolutely not. Every one of you can have your say in the development of standards, in the whole standardization process, and it's something I'd really like to try and encourage all of you today to do, is to actually get involved. And I'll explain a little bit about how you do that. And another one is the standards are expensive. Alas, that's both true and false. Standards can be expensive in some cases. Organizations like the ISO publish standards, and you pay sometimes quite dearly for standards. But there's a lot of standards that are open standards, a lot of standards that are free. Even within certain standards organizations like the ISO and the IEC, they do publish certain standards for free. For example, I'm the editor of a standard 29110 for very small organizations and their process life cycles. This is available for free. It's also available on the ISO web store to pay for, which is quite bizarre. But it's a freely available standard. And introducing a standard would take up a lot of time, effort and cost. Well, yes, it does take effort. Everything that's good takes effort. And if it takes effort, it therefore consumes time and consumes cost. The question is it worth it? And I have been involved in many studies of many small organizations that it is worth doing so. And speaking purely as an academic, has my personal commitment and time invested and money invested been worthwhile? Absolutely yes, and I'll show you some of the outcomes of those. People often say, oh, standards inhibit innovation or creativity. Absolutely not. In fact, if anything, standards are asking you the questions to continuously optimize what you do and improve the way you do things. And lastly, we don't need them, we already have the best solution. This one I hear a lot. I go into small software companies and say, yeah, it's okay, don't need this. We're already very good. And you go, really? Usually all it takes is one assessment or audit against a standard to persuade companies that they're not actually true. So let's examine the real truth behind standards. Okay? What I'm going to do for the purpose of the rest of the talk is just limit myself to one domain, and that's software and system engineering standards. Okay, so technological standards related to software, systems engineering, and all aspects thereof. So I've been involved originally in research into the area of standardization with, you could call me like a, I don't know, poacher term gamekeeper. I got involved in doing research into why people didn't use standards. I got into research into the lack of standards adoption and the lack of standards acceptance in Ireland in particular, and then that's studies that we replicate in a number of other countries. And we essentially did multiple longitudinal studies in a number of different countries into software product companies, trying to understand how their processes were formed, how they adapted, where process evolved, and the whole role of standardization inside in that. And we did this study with a very large number of companies in multiple geographical jurisdictions, and basically one picture to say what the results are. The result was this. It came down to cost being the barrier. All these other things outside it were issues. People said, oh, it's bureaucratic, oh, it inhibits creativity, it inhibits flexibility, it involves lots of documentation, and it costs lots of money. These are the perceptions, not the realities, but the perceptions. What was interesting to note is that now is more than 10 years since we did those first sets of studies. And you look at what happens to those companies. How do they survive? How do they thrive? And actually the answer is what happened to most of those companies. The vast majority of them aren't here today. And one can wonder about the health line of a company, the longevity of a company. Can standards help with this? Is there something there that standards can help to do? And it's rather interesting to look a little bit at IT failure and how standards may or may not be able to help in an area like this. An interesting figure for you, the truth behind VC-backed software startups and failures is really quite stark. 75% of VC-backed startups fail. In fact, there's an awful lot more failure going on than we ever really fully hear about or understand. Research indicates about 75% of VC-backed companies never return any cash to the investors. And 30 to 40% of those liquidating assets, the investors lose everything they put in, or the majority of what they put into them. This is a harsh fact. It's not something we know. Why not? Actually, I have a lovely quote here. I like this one from Wall Street Journal editor. Venture capitalists bury their dead very quietly. They don't want you to know. Of course not. We always like to talk about our success stories, not the 3/4 of the projects I invested in that made no money or failed. There's lots of reasons why these things happen. I'm just going to focus on the top number one. So there's a top 10 list, and I've decided only just to pick the first one on the top 10 list. Not learning from your mistakes. My view in the world is that God, if there is one, is a benevolent man or woman, being, deity, who wants us to be successful. And therefore, before we make any massive decisions, usually in our business environment, where we might blow up the company to smithereens, you usually find there's some warning signs. The problem is, a lot of the time, these are things that are ignored. People pump themselves up on their employees full of positive self-talk, you know. I won't make those mistakes again. Yes, we're going to do it. Yes, we'll do it better this time. We'll do it better next time. And then fall into the same pattern of behavior. If we only did a better job at fully grasping previous reasons for being unsuccessful, we might have a better equipped way of handling the future. So the idea is, from standards and standardization, can we not learn from what I mentioned earlier on, that global, international best practice and best practice from around the world? So as we look at why software projects fail, it's really quite straightforward. In the beginning of any software project, it's usually full of lots of enthusiasm and optimism. I know certainly I've worked in a few projects where in our first day at kickoff meetings in the very beginning, we've all been really happy. Okay, enthusiasm, optimism, sometimes wild enthusiasm. A little bit like this, you know, I'm the king of the world. You know, really good project, really good team. Anybody know where I'm going with this? Yeah, you see, what happens when you get there, okay? Too many projects still end in disaster. Too many projects still end up with the ship going down. And then, of course, what happens after that is we get into the blame game. And who do you blame? Well, of course, you have to blame management practices. It's management's fault. And arguably, this may well be a large element of truth into the practices that are instilled from at least a management level in an organization. And this is an area where, for example, standardization can help. Learning from best practices, learning from international best practices, learning from the mistakes of others. Standards tend to be developed based on the back of lots of experienced people and therefore lots of failed projects and lots of understanding about why things didn't work. So just keep up this Titanic theme for a minute, because I think there's an important thing in there for us as IT, ICT, software people. And that's just to think a little bit about icebergs. There's something we can learn from icebergs, I think. You could imagine as Kate and Leo wandered on the deck, there's a famous scene where their guys are kicking the pieces of ice like a football on the deck. And they admired them and they saw them as being very exotic phenomena. A bit like a software project to an outsider, some exotic black art of something really that we don't understand. You also think that most people don't really understand the anatomy of an iceberg. Okay? The reality is that 90% of an iceberg is hidden underwater. This is something many of you may know. I like this as a parallel to look at software products. If you take a software product, actually most software products are very like icebergs. What are people going to see? They're going to see the user interface up top. They may see some reports, physical reports that get thrown out of the system. But really very little about the corporate data. The business logic is almost totally hidden. And then as software engineers, the things we're interested in, the ilities, maintainability, extendability, stability, portability, all of these things. All of these ilities are some things that the customers really in general have no concept of and maybe don't care about. So that's the product itself. How about the project that we create in order to develop the software product? Actually, the project itself is a bit like an iceberg as well. I would argue that if you take the project as a whole, what happens is the customer sees the end product. They will see some of the people involved. God forbid they'll see the marketing people who are selling them all sorts of wonderful functionality. And they may see some business analysts and some team leaders, but very unlikely to see programmers, developers, designers, testers. And certainly they have no interest or understanding of the technologies that are involved, in the methodologies, in the tools and the practices. And finally, what underpins it all is the software development process and the standards that feed into that, and that's almost totally opaque. Most customers will never ever see this, never understand it. So in fact, that means we have a big challenge. We have a big challenge to lift this iceberg, to change the perspective of understanding. So change the way we communicate our work, making it more visible. So we have the time and the resources we need to actually be able to deliver a more successful product to a more understanding and more knowledgeable client. So we need to convey a real deep understanding that's not just the tip of the iceberg that matters. And I argue that highlighting the role of standards in our processes gives us that visibility. That in fact standards are something you can use to raise the platform. So that leads us with some software management puzzle and say, well, how do you do that? Well, of course, one of the problems is how do we work? Maybe the perfect way for software people to work is like the pair programming people will tell us. We should all be like this picture here. We should all work together around a computer, discussing everything, engaging fully and frankly, and every decision being made with collective wisdom. And maybe this is a perfect utopian way to work, but it's not the way we do work. The way we do work is quite often like this. It's isolated. Also, where do we work? I don't know about you, but I got a lot of work done on my flight here on Sunday afternoon. Or maybe you took a train to get here. You got internet on the trains, perfect, catching up with my emails. Or anywhere, sitting down having a cup of coffee. Or maybe you're working from home. Yes, you can recognize this, working from home. It's still work. We all work in different ways. The problem is that this leads to many different issues. So we can have different interpretations, say, of software requirements, for example, and without the correct way to discuss it. Errors can creep into code that's being developed and not get captured because they're not analysed or discussed correctly. There's a disconnect between the integration of the software that different individuals are writing. And there's sort of a ripple effect. These things can spread out and affect other people. So one of the arguments for addressing these problems and potential problems is following stricter processes, better processes. And that's where standardization a lot of the time will come into play. So one way to tackle these is a standardized approach, a standardized methodology to work. Provide us with something as simple as a common language. And I just dwell on that point for a minute. What is the language of our business? There isn't one. There are many attempts, there are several standards out there to try and capture a full taxonomy of the software development language, but there really isn't. If I say to you, all tasks are complete, well, what's a task? Okay, I can give you at least half a dozen international standards definitions for the word task in a software context. And what does complete mean? And the ambiguity behind some of these things. But what standardization does do is try to close that gap. Try to give us, hasn't succeeded, but trying to give us a closer match on the language we use, a closer understanding. Who's responsible for what, when, what sort of artifacts get produced, like plans, documents, databases, so on. So the next logical step for us is not only as an organization to look at an organization-wide process standards or methodologies, but make sure it's understood and adopted by all. So why standards? Let me give you just one example here from The Economist. I really like this as a quote. International standards have become at the same time the price of admission to the global economy and the glue that keeps us together. And adherence to standards is a condition of entry to the World Trade Organization, and global economy grows, so do they grow. So it's the price of admission to the global economy and the glue that keeps it together. Saying, how do you work with other organizations, with wider customers? How do you communicate across borders, transnationally, with confidence in your business? And often accreditation and standardization and conformity assessment are all aspects to that. So let's have a look at some standards uncovered. Certain elements of maybe perceptions, for example. So I said this before, perceptions take away your time from doing real work. I hear this a lot when I go into organizations. I'm doing real work. And, you know, I don't have time to do these other things. One of the expressions I hear a lot when I went into companies was they use the word luxury. I don't have the luxury of time to get involved in these things. And I think, what does that mean? Does that mean you don't have the luxury and time to do it right first time? You're accepting the fact you're not doing it correctly? And you're willing to pay the potential price for this? So the reality is new ways become the way, the only way of working, and it should be more efficient, less firefighting, fewer software errors, for example. The new way has to be considered doing real work, and finding those new ways is real work for people. It's not just additional work. Another common myth is the red tape argument. That, in fact, what happens is they say, oh, it stifles creativity, there's red tape, there's bureaucracy, there's doing silly things. And to be fair, I can see why these come into play. In some cases, these things exist. It's more about how you implement standards is really the issue. So if by creativity we mean developing new requirements for our software products, well then I do hope that's a side effect. If by creativity we mean new ways and new methods and more efficiencies, by all means, yes, please. So the reality is that standards provide a framework where all this creativity actually counts. So now you're going to think, oh, okay, he's really selling this motherhood and apple pie. I've got the cure for everything. Well, they do help. Quality standardization, particularly in software and systems and process, does help. Is it a cure for everything? Well, it depends on how it's designed, managed, and implemented. So I'm an Irishman, and I spent a year living in Iceland. So there's some Viking blood in me there somewhere. And as you know, Vikings, well, they came to Ireland and they had a lot of great parties. So here's a typical Icelandic party. And we have a great process in place here. And the text is a bit small, but let me explain. being explained here. There's a reception, there's a buffet, there's a long line, and here's how it's going to work. So this is the standard, this is the master plan, and it's all going to be perfect. Have you ever been to an Icelandic party? No? Oh, I have. Whoa. Yeah, they end up looking a little bit more like this. They're very good. So what does this mean? This means we might have the master plan, but really, no. What we have to do is have some common sense into how we do these things and what works. And there actually is one of the biggest stumbling blocks in the implementation of standards. People do silly things because they think that's what the standard wants them to do. So common sense is something that has to be implemented in standards. Really? Do you really need to tell somebody this? So hopefully a little bit of common sense comes into play when developing these things. So my message for you today is actually about getting involved. Step on. Join me, join us as a community, and get involved. So let me tell you why you should. What's in it for you? What's in it for the companies you might work with? What's in it for you as a researcher, as an academic? Why get involved? Well, one of the major strengths of standards and standardization is the people themselves that are involved in it. Okay, so one of the great strengths is that they are created by the people that need them. People with a genuine interest in the particular area. Be that particular area an MPEG encoding or a governance standard, an IT service management standard, whatever it happens to be. And both industry and academic experts drive all aspects of standardization, from deciding whether a new standard is actually needed to defining its technical content. So you end up with experts from academia and industry. My experience in software and systems engineering community is it's about 75% plus industry people. And that in itself is a great environment for as an academic researcher to hang around with industry experts and to get exposure to people helps me and my research greatly. And getting involved in this process can bring a lot of advantages to the business and to your academic career. So I'd like to try and appeal to maybe both sides of that. Let me give you one view from industry, okay? This is just one testimonial. There are lots of such testimonials, but here's one from the CEO of a Spanish company who said that taking part in standardization allows our company to have access to standards development. So they get access to the standards as they're being developed, as they're changing, that affect them and their organization. So they're in a time of strong international growth, and this participation allows us to adapt our products to future international regulations. So they're in a regulated industry, and they get to see what's coming, what's going to affect them, what changes. And they get to have a voice in this, but they also get to understand it earlier than many of the competition. So who is it that develops standards? I like Dilbert. So, are you the only one that came here for laughs? Who is it that actually develops standards? It's a variety of people. I said industry and academic experts. And the real question is your voice heard? Do you have a say? Can you have a say? Is it heard? If you're a large organization, commercial company, should your voice be heard? If it affects you, affects your business, should it be? And the answer is absolutely yes. When it comes to developing standards, essentially it comes down to a simple message. Either you're at the table or you're on the menu. It's really simple. You're either there making the changes proactively, or somebody else is going to do things and eat you up. If you want to be able to influence the standards that affect your organization, get recognized for your contributions, or simply connect with people. Maybe it's connecting with customers, suppliers, or research partners. For the academics to say, connecting with research partners can be very important. So having your voice heard is important. Having it heard in the right venue is very important. So don't develop standards at the kiddie table. Okay, if you're going to be at the table, make sure please you're at the right table. One that's accredited, internationally recognized, one with a track record, and one with rules to protect a level playing field. So the world's largest producer of standards is ISO. So I'll just talk about ISO for a minute. So the International Organization for Standardization is the world's largest developer of standards. It's a non-governmental, it's an NGO. It consists of a network of 162 different countries. And ISO essentially provides a platform to allow each country to reach consensus on solutions that meet the current requirements of business, society, industry, academia. Consensus is a very interesting thing in ISO. The definition of consensus is a lack of sustained opposition. I like that one. I give that to you again. A lack of sustained opposition. So I might disagree with you, but will I eventually just stop disagreeing with you? And now we have consensus. Quite interestingly, one country, one vote. So I come from Ireland, relatively small country, 5 million people. When I sit at an international standards table, it's usually 2 or 3 of us there from Ireland. And on one side of me, I usually have, for the last couple of years now, a lady from India representing this enormous country. And to my left side, well, depending on how they decide to order it by title, it's usually the Ivory Coast, unless they put it down as Côte d'Ivoire, in which case I have Italy beside me. So usually Ivory Coast and India and me, 3 of us sitting together, very different delegations, but one vote. Each country, one vote. In the domain of ISO, for example, just looking at ICT standards, here's a little graphic to show you. I said I'd just limit it to software systems engineering, just to give some context. But there's many of them there. Project management standards, systems engineering, industrial engineering standards, quality management standards, safety standards, mission critical standards, dependability standards, general computer science standards, and operating in a whole lot of different application domains. Say it could be medical device domains, safety critical domains, nuclear domains, things like that. So who is it that develops these things? Developed by groups of experts within technical committees made up of representatives from industry, NGOs, universities, governments, and so on. ISO actually has about 250 active committees. And it's people just like you and me involved in these things. So I'll tell you a little about what I do in my standards work. I do essentially 3 things. I develop standards, I teach to my students standards, and I conduct research in the area of standardization. So my involvement in the community allows me to help develop standards, and I have a better understanding of them, and I'm able to translate that in terms of knowledge transfer back to my students. And if I was to appeal to the academics in the audience here, I'd say also research. It's an area where it's really, I think, underexploited in terms of research and ripe with many, many opportunities. I'll show you that hopefully in a moment. My engagement is with a number of different standards bodies, and here are the main ones. Most of it is through ISO and IEC as the largest, and my nature engagement is from a variety of things, from being a convener of mirror committees to being an editor of a series of standards in a whole number of different areas of things of interest to me. And across a whole lot of different industry sectors. So the question is, what do I actually do? I attend about 2 international meetings a year per committee that I'm involved in. I participate in discussion groups. You contribute to actually helping write standards, editing them, keeping an eye from the point of view of Ireland Incorporated on emerging standards that might affect Irish industry and advising the government on that. And briefing our national standards body, NSAI, the Irish National Standards Body, and talking about standards, events just like this. What I really give is those 2 pictures, time and money. One of the slightly strange things is it costs you money to get involved in the standardization. I have to fly to meetings. I have to leave my normal day job aside. So it's an investment in time and a minor investment, modest investment maybe in money. But there is a lot of reward out of it. Well, standards can be fun, by the way. It's not really just about convincing 83 companies to benefit from our particular way of doing things. There can be a bit of fun. If you don't know it or you haven't heard it, the ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, has a nickname. It's known as the International Sightseeing Organization. Why? I try to put a pin on the map of places I've been to standards meetings. You know, typically we swap continents and hemispheres for every meeting, so it becomes interesting. But I want to focus maybe specifically here about research and how it helps in my research and how you can leverage standardization and your expertise in your particular domain in terms of your research. For a start, it's a route to publishing. And we heard in yesterday's opening, Martin talked very eloquently about publishing and metrics and H-indexes and all of these terrible things that we simply, as academics, find ourselves under more and more pressure. And it's a game, I believe, we just have to play, like it or not. I tend not, but we have to play the game. And it is a route. So, for example, in my direct involvement in standards, I publish a lot of papers at conferences. So about 34 papers so far in just the area of standards. Now, I don't put that slide up to say, oh, look at me, I'm great. I put them to show you an example that there is lots and lots of possibilities of avenues of conferences where you could talk about standards. Everything from the development of a new standard, how you pilot it. I've worked with companies to pilot the standards practices in an evolving standard before it ever gets published, before it gets made official. I do experiments in teaching standards and standardization to my students. Most recently, doing some VR virtual reality environments for teaching standards to students, and also as a precursor to industry, so they're education related. You can have an awful lot of different things. I'm involved also in producing a large number of journal papers in this area, and there are some journals in that whole area of standardization. But maybe something else that's given me as a researcher is access to people, access to experts. So you go into the standards room, and typically when I go to an SC7 plenary meeting, there could be 200, 250 people there. And as I said to you before, the overwhelming majority of those are industry people. So I'm interested in working very much with industry on industry relevant and industry focused problems. And this gives you the opportunity to talk to people and get access to companies. So one of the hardest things I found as an academic researcher is to get access to individuals and companies and maybe do things like case studies and surveys. And yet you're at the standards table with these organizations, and they're giving time and effort to be involved in this, and hey presto, you can come up with new projects that are very interesting, very exciting in this area. Okay, almost there. End of the road is in sight. So let me just give you my opinion, okay? That if you look at the hallmarks of our industry, the software industry, the unfortunate truth is that most projects, as we know, are delivered late. Deadlines are missed. Most projects go over budget. They cost more than had been planned. Most projects aren't fully functional, as in they didn't actually deliver all the functionality as promised when they were delivered. And we live in a world where we accept a certain amount of software defects as being the norm, and heavy amounts of rework to remove them, and bug fixing and patching and so on as the norm. So I go back to my earlier slide about banging your head against the wall and going, well, do we want to just keep repeating the mistakes of the past? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is kind of crazy. So my argument is that standardization helps us on a path to improvement. So I don't know what your opinion is, but we can continue with this historical pace, or we can transform things to be more efficient, to be more mature organizations, and therefore make more money. So my argument to you, both industry and academics, is to get involved. And it's actually very easy to get involved. There's lots of different standards bodies. Here's the logos of all of them. Because we're in Poland, I've given the Polish normalization organization the pride of place there as the local standards body here. But you talk to your local standards body, whoever that is in your country. You talk to national delegates, people like me, in your home countries. And you typically will find the barriers to entry in most countries are actually very low. They welcome active participation. Before I finish up, one little bit of shameless promotion, if I'm allowed to indulge myself, please. So I'm the editor-in-chief of the journal Computer Standards and Interfaces. This is one of the journals that is a publishing route to people involved in the standardization business, in all aspects of standards, protocols, communication, measurement, a wide variety of things. And I would be very keen to receive more papers from people. So if you have, and this is an area of interest, please talk to me at the coffee breaks here, or the lunch break, or drop me an email. And I'd be very happy to talk to you about that. I was told 45 minutes, and it's now 30 seconds. Ha! I keep to time. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.